Welcome to EPG Pathshala. My name is Dr. Neeraj Agarwal and I am Assistant Professor in University Institute of Hotel and Tourism Management, Punjab University, Chandigarh. I am presenting lecture on module titled Whisky. Under the paper titled Food and Beverage, Service Operations and Management. After completing this module, the learners would be able to understand meaning of whisky, manufacturing process of whisky and their ingredients, types of whisky, differentiate between Scotch, single malt, American and Irish whisky, brand names of various whiskies. Firstly, discuss about the introduction. Whisky is defined as an alcoholic beverage distilled from cereal, grains and matured in wood cask. The word whisky is derived from aqua vitae, the Latin equivalent of the Gaelic usage vitae or water of life. It is said that the spirit was first produced in Ireland. Irish monks brought the craft of distillation with them when they settled in Scotland. Thereafter, the Scots set about making whisky the most internationally enjoyed spirit, helped, of course, with inputs from Irish, American, and Canadian producers. The invention of coffee still revolutionized the whisky industry. As a result, lighter whisky started getting produced with the grains like maize, barley, and rye. Previously, only high flavored pot stills were available. Whisky usually comes with a strength of 40 to 55% alcohol by volume. Along with Scotland, other countries like America, Ireland, Canada also produce world-renowned whiskies. Japan is also coming up with some excellent whiskies in this modern era. Whiskies from Scotland. This is a whisky made in Scotland which dominates the whisky world. Its flavor and quality are governed by the type of cereal used, the malting process, the peat used, the water, the distilling equipment, and the skills of the distillers and the blenders. In Scotland, whisky is spelled as whisky, and in general, whisky from Scotland is referred as Scotch whiskies. Whiskies from Scotland can be blended, grain, and malt whiskies. Scotch whisky is mostly retailed at standard dark spirit strength of 40% alcohol by volume or perhaps slightly above. A small portion of the best grades are bottled from barrel undiluted. These are known as cask strength whiskies. Now we'll discuss about types of Scotch whisky. Grain whisky. These types of whiskies are made by grain such as maize, wheat, millet and some barley plus a little malted barley. Maize is usually the main ingredient and when ground, it is cooked under steam pressure to convert the starch of grain into fermentable sugar. These whiskies are produced by coffee still and is light-bodied by nature. It is usually a quicker process and cheaper than malt whiskies. The second type of whiskey is blended whiskey. For making blended whiskies, 50% blend of malt and 50% grain whiskies are used. More amount of malt can be referred as deluxe whiskies. These whiskies spend longer time in cask and are expensive and smoother in taste. More than 90% of whiskies produced in Scotland are blended whiskies. The object of the blending is to iron out the rough edges of individual whiskies and produce something that will appeal to a broader taste. Blended whiskies are also states the number of years in their label, indicating the number of years whiskies get matured in casks. The blended whisky from Scotland are Ballantyne. The Antiquary Bills, Chivas Regal, Black and White, Hague's, Dimple, Cutty Sark, Johnny Walker Black Label, Henke Bannister, Old Par, Teachers, Usher's Deluxe, VAT 69, Red Hackle. The third is malt whisky. All Scotch malt whiskies must be produced only with malted barley. You will find malt whiskies sold as either single malt or wetted malt. Single malt. It produced by a single distillery from a single year. It must be made from 100% barley malt and distilled in pot stills only. The majority are twice distills. The alcohol levels cannot exceed 165-degree proof. Wetted or blended malt. These whiskies are made from 100% barley malt and are blended from at least two different distilleries. The alcohol level also cannot exceed 165-degree proof. Blended malt whiskies were previously called wetted malt. Now, whiskies region of Scotland. The first one is lowland. Whiskies of this region are smooth and slightly fiery, light in salty and peat. Most of the lowland whiskey is served as an aperitif. Brands are Auchenstone, Blacknotch, Glenichy, Ladyburn, Little Milk, Highland, Rosebank. The second region is Highland region. Largest whiskey producing region. Highland whiskies are powerful, rich flavor and quite smoky. Many of the famous distilleries are located around the river Spey. The important brands are Macallan, Knockando, Singleton, Glenmoran, Northport, Glenwith, Glenmorgan, Glenfarclas, Glenfitch, Glengrant and Glennord. And Glen means valley. The third region is Island region. There are many fine malt made in this island which consist of Islay, Jura, Mull, Orkney and Skye. The important brands are Arran, Blackwood, Jura, Talisker, Tobermory, Highland Park, Scapa, Laperhulia, Isles of Jura. And the fourth region is Speyside. It has received its name from the river Spey. Good choice of rich flavor, complexity and relatively mild character. Whiskies are get from this region. The examples are Glenmorangie and Glenspey. And the fifth region is Campbelltown, once known as the whisky capital of Scotland. Whiskies are heavy and smoky of this region. The important brands are Glengyle, Glen-Scotia, Springbank and Lone Grove. Now we discuss about single malt whiskies. The important brands are following are the world famous single malt whiskies along with single malt from Glen family distilleries. The famous single malt whiskies from Glen family are Springbank, Glengyle, Lone Grove, Glen-Scotia, Knockando Glenmorangie, Macallan Glenspey, Singleton Glenfitch, Tormore Glenlivet, Rosebank Glenmorangie, Talisker Glenkinch, Highland Park Glengrant, Laperhulia Glenfarclas and Legueville Glennord. Now we'll discuss about the whiskey manufacturing. The whiskey making process has changed a little over our years. All whiskies are made of grain, barley, maize, corn and rye, water and yeast. Most of the distillers use barley as a grain, especially Scotch whiskies. Distillers also require lot of pure cold water in order to make whiskey. Most of them uses spring water, but large sources and even town suppliers are also used. Yeast is also used in whiskey making for fermentation. Following process is used by distilleries where whiskey is being made for whiskey manufacturing. And thus the first step is malting. Barley, when steeped or soaked in water, is known as malt. To produce good malt, the barley must be of good quality and low in nitrogen, as nitrogen may affect the fermentation. Malting has three distinct steps. A. Steeping. After screening the barley to remove any extraneous matter, it is put into a large tank and steeped in water to a moisture content of about 45%. This simply accelerated version of the absorption of water, which would normally occur over several weeks in the soil. The grain absorbs the water and oxygen, which leads to germination. B. Germination. This is the commencement of growth when the food reserves in the grain, namely starch and protein, are broken down into sugar and amino acids. The moist grain is spread onto a malting floor which is air conditioned to assist germination. Each grain sprouts tiny rootlets, and at the same time the enzyme begins to convert the starch into sugar. C. Killing. After about 5 days, when germination reached the desired stage, further development is stopped by killing. The grain is gently dried by hot air and moisture is removed. This will help in stop germination but will not impart any flavor. The second method of killing is to dry the barley over a peat fire, imparting a smoky flavor. Peat is been made from decomposed vegetation. The second is milling. Malted barley is taken to the distillery where the malts are ground by passing it through a mill, producing a fine black powder called grist. Then we go for mashing. The grist is transferred to a very large vessel known as mash tun, where it is mashed with hot water, keeping the temperature at 65 degrees centigrade, allowing the enzymes formed during malting to convert the starch into fermentable sugars. The resulting sweet brown liquid is known as wort. The final water is then retained as the first water of the next batch. After this, we go for fermentation. During fermentation process, yeast is added, which converts the sugar into alcohol, which can be done in open-ended vessel or close-ended vessel. In Scotland, malt distillers prefers close-ended vessels, whereas grain distillers used both open-ended and closed vessels, though the latter are widely favored in the United States. The speed and vigor of fermentation can be controlled by having a cooling system. This may be in the vessel itself or in the hall where the fermentation vessels stands, known as turn rooms. Wooden fermentation vessels are still widely used, sometimes coexisting with stainless steel in the same turn room. Short fermentation nearby 48 hours produces malty character whiskies, whereas long fermentation nearly 55 hours produces lighter, complex and flavored whiskies. After fermentation, we go for distillation. The wash has an alcoholic strength of 8% alcohol by volume. This is then distilled twice in the pot stills. The first distillation in a wash still will produce spirit of 23% alcohol by volume, known as low wines, which is then redistilled. This time the distillate is divided into three: foreshoots, heart and faints. Only the heart is retained for maturation. The foreshoots and faints are recycled with the next batch of low wines. After distillation, we go for maturation. It is the mellowing of whiskey by being stored in oak barrels or casks. Scotch whiskey must be matured for 3 years, and the American classics are usually aged for not less than 4 years. The optimum period varies according to the whiskey. Maturation helps in oxidation of some components of the whiskey is one of the phenomena that plays during aging. Extraction of flavors from the wood is another. Vanilla in bourbon whiskies and tannins may comes from the oak. Maturation of single malt whiskies can take place in ex-bourbon or ex-sherry refill cask. It takes time to mature whiskey. After that, we go for bottling. Before bottling, chill filtration is done, which stops a whiskey going cloudy, and sometimes spirit caramel is also added to standardize color. Now, we are going to discuss the factors which affect the Scotch whiskies. The first one is maximum flavor and aroma of the spirit retains in Scotch whiskey due to pot still. Second, spring water contains the essential minerals giving a distinctive character to the whiskey. Third, Scotch whiskey use peat fire to impart smoky flavor. Fourth, Whiskey maturing in the cask help in giving a distinct flavor to the Scotch whiskey. Fifth, Irish whiskey, spelled as whiskey, is from Ireland, made from malted and unmalted barley and very small quantities of other grain. It is triple distilled and as a result, it has less cognous flavoring elements which make it light and easy on the palate. No peat is used in the cleanse, so there is none of the smoky pungency that is present in some degree in most Scotch whiskies. As per Irish law, it must be matured for at least 5 years in oak casks, which gives it a distinctive and smooth finish. Most Irish whiskey is a blend of coffee and pot still products. Important features of the Irish whiskies are listed as below. Generally made from mash of mixed malted and unmalted grain, produced by using both pot still and patent still method, produced by using unpeated malt except Commonera peated Irish malt. They are triple distilled except Connemara peated Irish malt. Matured for at least 5 years before blending. The brand names are Tullamore, Dew, Bushmills, Jameson, Paddy's, Middleton, Powers Gold Label, and we should note cogners are impurities which gives whiskey a flavor and aroma. However, their presence are not to be judged as excess cogners will result the spirits undrinkable. These are generally a chemical compounds which are being produced while making whiskey during fermentation and maturation in casks. They include methanol, furfural, fusel oils, tannin, acetaldehydes. Cogners are present in darker spirits such as brandy and whiskey, except tequila, and in wine, which also cause hangover and have greater intoxication. Now, we'll discuss about Canadian whiskey. Canadian whiskey is made from mixture of grains like rye, malted barley, corn and wheat. Canadian whiskies are produced by coffee still and aged in charred oak cask for 3 years. It is somewhere between Scotch and Bourbon to taste, being light in body and flavor and slightly sweet. A curiosity of Canadian whiskey is that the regulation permits the addition of a tiny quantity of other drink products such as sherry or wine made from grapes or other fruits. While this may account to more than 100th part of the finished product, imparting fruitiness in the whiskies. The important brand names are Canadian Club, Crown Royal, Black Velvet, Royal Reserve. Now, I will discuss about American whiskey. In American whiskey is spelled with an E as it is in the Ireland. It was Britishers and the Irish settlers who brought their own whiskey with them from the old countries and helped in the development of American whiskey. The first American whiskies were made with malted barley and rye. Soon, a group of distillers start producing pure corn whiskies in Bourbon country and Kentucky. Now, we'll discuss about the types of American whiskies. The first one is Bourbon whiskies. Classic American whiskey, which is made from maize, rye, and malted barley. Bourbon takes its name from Bourbon County, Kentucky, those also known as Kentucky whiskies. It must contain at least 51% corn plus rye, wheat or malted barley. It is distilled in a continuous still and is matured in a charred oak cask for a minimum of 4 years. Kentucky Bourbon must be distilled and matured in Kentucky for a minimum of these years. The important brand names are Jim Beam, Wild Turkey, Early Times, Old Grandad, Maker's Mark, and Four Roses. Second is rye whiskey. This whiskey is distilled mainly from a wash containing a minimum of 51% rye and distilled in a continuous still and aged for a minimum of 2 years in a new charred oak barrels. No coloring and flavoring is allowed. Third, corn whiskey. This American whiskey is made from 50% corn mash. Sour mash, this is made by using some of the spent mash made from warm fermentation to start the next fermentation. This will continue the flavor and style. Maker's Mark is an example of sour mash whiskey. The fifth, Tennessee whiskey. This is a sour mash whiskey which is charcoal filtered before being matured in barrels. Most American whiskeys are matured in charred oak barrels, which gives a distinct flavor to the whiskeys. Now, about Japanese whiskey. Scotch inspired Japanese whiskey. Scottish Academic Institution trained in the first whiskey makers of Japan. Scotch whiskey and Japanese whiskies are closely related, but each with a slightly different character. Most obvious distinction between Scotch whiskies and Japanese whiskies is the extent of their peatiness. The classic Scotch whiskies have a definite peatiness through its extent varies from one to another. In Japan too, peatiness is usually present but in a very subtle manifestation. Water in Japan is also crystal clean like Scottish Highland, flowing over granite and peat too, giving a hint of peat in the whiskey. Japanese whiskey have a light note. The Japanese whiskey is made from millet, corn and rice. Both pot still and continuous still methods of distillation are used. Sometimes genuine Scotch whiskey is added while blending. The peat is imported from Scotland to give the distinguished flavor. The important brand names are Hibiki, Yamazaki, Hakushu, Komagrate, Yoichi, Nikka. Now, we are discussing about the comparison of Irish Scotch, Bourbon and Canadian whiskies on the basis of service of whiskey. Scotch whiskey and Irish whiskey served straight or with a splash of spring water or ice in old-fashioned glass. Malt whiskey served straight with a few drops of spring water, while Canadian whiskey served straight or on the rocks or with a splash of soda water. Thank you and have a nice day.